Okay, so Chris, I really appreciate you talking to me today, and also, of course, to the people who'll be watching this, the students at the University of Waterloo. We're going to talk about the impact of technology, or how technology is being used, the way that it impacts people in very important aspects of their lives.
Mm.
I thought I would start. You describe your work as being at the intersection of technology, safety, health, and gender. So, can you just say a little bit about what you mean by that, just to introduce what you do?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to speak with you. My background is actually so for my undergraduate degree, I studied mathematics, I studied French, I did a bit of education and policy. My background is really all over the place before I came here to this field. Perhaps that's part of the reason why I describe myself as so interdisciplinary in terms of this description. I'm really interested in the sociology of technology. So to state that differently, I'm interested in how technology shapes people's everyday lives, especially when it comes to safety, health, and inequality. So in that regard, I'm interested in understanding how people actually experience technology in practice, whether that's on dating apps or social media or other digital platforms, and then how those experiences can support their well-being or in some cases can lead to harm. In regard to like gender and sexuality, those are two identity factors that play a big role because not everybody encounters technology in the same way. Uh, for me in particular, I'm interested in 2S LGBTQ plus people. My research also looks at youth and racialized communities, and these populations often face different risks online. These populations are also often the ones developing important strategies to stay safe and build community. So that's why I just say that my work sits at this intersection because I'm interested in understanding both the harms and the possibilities of technology, especially for people who are often looked in how those systems are designed.
The focus that you've described is so important because you rightly identify that the impact of technology varies amongst different people, different cultures, different orientations, and so on. And when people are involved in developing, applying technology, being aware of the diversity of the impact of what they're doing is so important. So you've looked at the risks associated with dating apps, particularly for 2SLGBTQ plus people. Can you describe what the risks are, perhaps for everyone, if it's possible to do that, but also what the specific risks are for 2SLGBTQ plus people?
Absolutely. Yeah. So to be clear, there are some risks on dating apps that affect pretty much everybody. This includes things like harassment, unwanted sexual messages or images, scams, fraud. Increasingly, there's concerns about privacy and what is done with people's data, especially with AI and artificial intelligence. So these are pretty widespread experiences across platforms that everybody deals with. Um, where things differ is in terms of how these harms happen and how severe those harms are. So stated differently, the differences here can be around prevalence and severity. So research actually consistently shows that marginalized groups, including 2S LGBTQ plus people, experience these risks at higher rates. So sexual minority users are actually more than twice as likely to experience unwanted sexual behavior online compared to heterosexual users. But as I said before, it's not just about frequency, it's not just about prevalence, it's also about the nature of these harms. So 2S LGBT plus people often face identity-based abuse like homophobia, transphobia. They can also be outed if they're not publicly out. Trans and non-binary people can also be fetishized, misgendered, or targeted in ways that directly tied to their identity. So in that regard, we actually see really important differences across heterosexual and gender diverse, sexually diverse communities. But to be clear, we also see differences within 2S LGBT plus communities. My research has shown that, my research and others' research has found that gay men actually face higher levels of sexual coercion or pressure While lesbian and queer women often deal with harassment from men or from couples, and trans people can face especially high rates of discrimination and violence, even from those within 2S LGBT plus communities. So that's really where risks are shaped by factors like age, race, gender, sexuality, disability. So when we look at harms, we have to look at the full picture. And so then when we're thinking about what's happening with dating apps, we can recognize that yes, there are harms that impact everybody, but also when identity comes into play, there are certain harms that might affect more people more than others.
And are those harms becoming normalized? So, this it's a new environment. These harms are things that people may have been exposed to some degree in other forms outside of through their use of technology. But in understanding these new harms, are we sufficiently recognizing that they are harms and acting on that? Or have they become accepted as normal practice?
It's a great question. And it's, again, part of the reason that I'm interested in doing this research. I think these everyday experiences that people have with technology are so important to understand and to scrutinize. Because otherwise, if we don't take a critical lens, if we don't have a critical approach to what's happening, it can be very easy to normalize these everyday harms. So in response to your question, actually, yes, I do think that's one of the most important things to understand is that many of these harms have become normalized. Um, so in my research and in others, my colleagues' research, we consistently see that behaviors like harassment, unsolicited sexual images, pressure for sex, coercion, they're often treated as just part of the experience of using digital platforms, specifically dating apps. People tend to think that sending or receiving unsolicited sexual images, like dick pics or nudes, they're often viewed as something that's just a normal part of the experience. It's an expected behavior that people anticipate when they use dating apps. So even though this is widely recognized as a common behavior, it still can be an infraction of consent. Somebody could feel harassed or they might experience this as inappropriate. Um, but nonetheless, some users come to expect it, they tolerate it, or they might even perpetuate it as typical behavior in these spaces. So, in that regard, normalization is shaped both by social norms and the design of dating apps themselves. Because we have to recognize that dating apps are they are sexual environments. So people might communicate quickly, visually, and we know either on dating apps or other platforms, they can perform with a degree of anonymity. So these features, which in the social sciences we call them affordances, can actually make it easier for harmful behaviors to occur, even if unintentionally. And this then makes it harder for users to establish boundaries and maintain consent. Um, we also see similar patterns across populations. So, one of the projects that I'm doing now is around youth here in Canada. So, looking at young people aged 13 through 18, and we're trying to understand the digital harms that they experience through their use of technology. And our data has shown that young people are being sent sexual images without consent, and it's actually one of the most common forms of technology facilitated sexual violence experienced by teens in Canada. So this isn't just a problem on dating apps. This is a problem that reflects wider digital cultures where behaviors are increasingly normalized. Um, and so, again, the problem is not just that normalization makes harms harder to recognize and address. It's actually that people start to see these behaviors as normal or just how this is. And so there's this kind of nihilistic mentality that's being applied in that if I just keep scrolling, if I just deal with it, it'll go away. It's not that severe. It's not that problematic, especially if others around me are experiencing the same thing. So all of these social norms can come together to discourage reporting. It can reduce accountability. And unfortunately, it also shifts responsibilities onto individuals to manage their own safety. So when we're thinking about how do we respond to this, that's why solutions can't only focus on individual users. We need stronger platform accountability. We need clearer consent practices and education. And we also need public awareness around digital ethics so that safety isn't something that users have to negotiate, but it's something that they're built into and they feel comfortable using on these different digital platforms.
So what you seem to be saying, if I'm correct in interpreting it, is that normalization means that there is a lot of behavior, or there is behavior, I don't know how much, that is harmful to many people, and that this is something that's become accepted, and that that's wrong, that this acceptance is there, and that there is a need to address this.
Absolutely. That's one big reason why we need to have public education campaigns. There needs to be awareness raising that's done in schools with parents, with communities. Local organizations such as community groups or youth programs can also be a great place of intervention. My colleagues and I are actually working on a report right now to try to influence public policy at the national level. You might recall, there was the online harms bill that was introduced in Parliament 2 years ago. Ultimately, it failed, but this government is trying to bring back elements of it or propose different similar bills to try to address these problems of digital harms. And so my colleagues and I on this project, we strongly believe that there's a need for a type of national agency that could provide education not only to young people, but to folks of all ages, that could also provide support services and resources, and really just make sure that these problems can be dealt with in a reliable and consistent way.
Yeah, good. The clickable consent. You've
Yes.
mentioned consent a little bit so far,
Yep.
but you've researched the concept of clickable consent. So can you tell me about what you found when you looked at this?
Absolutely. So, clickable consent is a concept that I termed in order to describe how some people understand consent on dating apps. So, broadly speaking, it's the idea that consent is a one-time action, something that you simply give by logging into an app rather than something that's an ongoing practice that would need to be like communicated and negotiated throughout an interaction. So, in this way of thinking, being on an app signals a kind of blanket, overarching consent to any sexual interaction that would happen when you're in that space. So, as long as someone is active on the platform, their presence would be interpreted by others as an openness to sexual messages, images, or advances. So, consent, this type of idea of clickable consent, then would be something that begins when you log in and ends when you leave. Um, to be clear, this idea is not necessarily novel. I took some inspiration from gay men's practices in sexual spaces like bathhouses. So being in that environment doesn't necessarily mean that somebody wants or agrees to every interaction, but it can create an expectation of sexual openness. The issue then is with dating apps that the expectation can become overgeneralized, where people might assume consent rather than actually checking for it. And so, what I found in this research on this project is that this idea of clickable consent creates real tensions between how people understand consent and how they practice it. Participants in my study said they could define consent, and they actually talked about it as being something that was enthusiastic, affirmative, ongoing. They said it should be explicit and mutual. But even though they could define consent as an idea, as a concept, in practice, what they did didn't necessarily match with their understanding. And the implications of this are quite important because if we might understand consent in one way, but practice it in another, that can create real concerns around the difference between what is felt and experienced versus what is understood. And when consent is treated as automatic, such as with clickable consent, it can blur boundaries and make it easier for harmful behaviors. So this also makes it harder then for people to assert boundaries because if everything is automatically a yes in this space, or there's the expectation for openness, that would then make it difficult to set boundaries and communicate disinterest. So ultimately, this idea about clickable consent, it highlights a broader issue, is that daily dating apps are highly sexualized digital environments, but they don't always have clear norms or tools. There are certainly norms that are expected in this space, but different people can have different ideas and practices, which then can create tensions or transgressions as people apply those in their interactions. And so then that gap leaves users to figure this out for themselves, which can lead to misunderstandings, pressure, or in some cases, harm.
And I mean, you've talked about online harms, and now we're talking specifically around consent. But
Mhm.
in both of these areas, it would appear that we're in the period at the moment where we're defining what is good and what's bad as far as behavior is concerned, what should be normalized, what shouldn't be normalized, which I guess in some ways is understandable with new forms of communication and technology and interaction. But at the same time, it does also highlight that unless we have a conscious approach to this, and actively, formally define to some degree acceptable practice or create good norms, there is this at least this period we're going to go through before we do. Hopefully, we reach a point where things are more friendly.
Absolutely. And again, you're speaking to kind of a broader societal issue at this point that isn't unique to dating apps or social media in general. It's just right now, I think we're kind of at a public reckoning where these questions around social norms or what is expected or acceptable behavior in people's use of technology varies greatly. There's big differences in terms of what is seen as, yeah, again, acceptable behavior or unacceptable behavior. And until we as a society have a common understanding of what counts as harm or what counts as a transgression or even just a general problem, there's still going to be a lot of issues in terms of then how do we address these concerns and what does an acceptable response to those concerns look like?
Okay, part of the response to perhaps part of the response to the situation we have now is lies in the decline of use of dating apps that you've looked at, and you've suggested that there's a degree of burnout maybe there for people who are using them. What do you feel is happening here? Are people going back to, real life dating?
So I think there's a couple things to keep in mind here. Is that with every generation, there's going to be new behaviors, new practices, right? And so as young people grow up, and certainly nowadays when technology is changing ever so constantly, there's always kind of a search for something new or something different and to question what is happening rather than it just be kind of an assumption that we should continue with what previous generations have done. And again, in this sense, I'm using the word generations more loosely because even with technology, what is defined as a generation can differ from one year to the next. But yes, if we're talking about Gen Z, there are growing indications from industry reports, online polls or surveys, media coverage that dating app use may be shifting, specifically with Gen Z. For example, there have been surveys that found like many Gen Z users report feeling fatigued or burnt out by dating apps. They're concerned about things like repetitive interactions, swiping, ghosting. They feel that there's a lack of meaningful connection. But at the same time, there are companies like Match Group, who actually owns many popular platforms, including Tinder and Hinge. They've reported fluctuations in paid subscriptions and user engagement across different quarters. There's data from the UK, Ofcom, so they're the tech regulator in the United Kingdom. They also reported a decline in dating app use in 2024, though there hasn't been long-term data to confirm that that's a sustained trend. So all this to say, oh, and to keep in mind, actually, in Canada, we don't necessarily have robust, publicly available national data. There hasn't been enough independent academic research to definitively say whether dating app use is declining. But that said, it does seem that how people are using dating apps, or there's cultural shifts in terms of what specifically Gen Z is looking for when they're approaching dating. So many are experiencing with alternatives rather than just using swipe-based apps like Tinder. This could be using different platforms like Instagram or TikTok, where interactions can feel more organic and less transactional. Specifically because people can also have an online profile that shows who they are as a person rather than this idea of a curated profile that you might see on a dating app. and again, that idea of curated can still be debated, but nonetheless, these social spaces like Instagram and TikTok can formulate this idea that connections then might be more authentic around like your travel or social events, the hobbies that you have. That kind of a thing. That again, it might be more authentic to the interactions you have with your peers rather than just something you present on a dating app. There are also media reports that Gen Z are preferring what is called meet cute moments, which is essentially just this idea that you're going back to offline or in-person physical interactions that are a bit more spontaneous and fun rather than again curated that as might be online. Um, so all that to say, I wouldn't say that Gen Z is abandoning dating apps altogether. I think they're just becoming more critical, perhaps also because of the pandemic that they've lived through. You know, they're looking for other opportunities to connect, and they might be less willing to rely on dating apps as their primary or only way to meet people. So in sum, the reasons for the shift are around, it seemed to be around burnout and fatigue, this perceived lack of authenticity around like swiping and curation. Some people are citing these negative experiences like ghosting, harassment, unwanted sexual interactions. All of this that can be harmful or feel unsafe. And lastly, most importantly, especially when dating, there's a desire for a meaningful connection. So whether that's online or in person, there's kind of that renewed interest in being critical and finding what an actual meaningful connection can look like.
Okay, you may have, I think you've suggested some of your response to my next question already in your previous response, but what would a perfect dating app be to you? Or, how could dating apps be improved? Because I know you've looked at dating apps quite a lot, you've studied them. So, what would you have in your app?
You know, this is such a fun question. It always makes me think of, and I might be dating myself now, but like when we think back to when Apple launched their App Store and they said, there's an app for that, you know, like there's always this idea that there could be something that could be changed or improved. And certainly where technology is concerned, I think it's fantastic to ask this question about what can be changed and knowing what some of the issues are, how can we try to fix those? And actually, even jump before I get into answering your question, that is something else that I would just like to mention that we're even seeing right now is the dating app companies themselves are starting to kind of play around with artificial intelligence with AI as a means to try to reinvent online dating. So we're seeing the rise of AI dating coaches. We're seeing AI photo curation, profile curation. We're seeing there's help with the prompts or conversation starters. So there's different ways that these dating app companies are trying to mobilize AI to address some of these issues that Gen Z and other generations have noted in order to bring back customers and kind of revitalize this idea of online dating. But that said, to go back to your question, some things that I would say are really important, first and foremost, is shifting away from this idea that safety is the user's responsibility. I've done some work, and colleagues of mine have done work, really noting that there's an onus on the individual to be responsible for themselves. And while absolutely we all have independent agency, there's a lot that people can do to control their situation. We have to also recognize that there are systemic factors that can influence the harms that people experience. And so dating app companies should instead build their products around safety, consent, and accountability, where these practices, these ideals are built into the platform, their policies, and just their overall platform governance structure. Um, there also should be a focus to take away the emphasis on speed and volume and engagement. And there again, that's not just a problem with dating apps, but with digital platforms in general, and social media particularly being one of them. So I would suggest that we should focus more on care, consent, ethics, and meaningful interaction so that we can try to mitigate these harms as much as possible and encourage careful behavior such as behaviors around care. Um, yeah, so what I say is design apps around consent, not just connection. Trees and talking about what is a yes versus a no. I do think that there should be stronger accountability and moderation on the part of tech companies. Um, Participants in my studies have actually talked about reporting systems often being reactive and inconsistent. So even if they were to flag a user to the tech company, it's not always necessarily known what is happening, what has happened to that report, or if there's any consequence for the person who has been reported. So it'd be great to see fast response times, transparent enforcement, and meaningful consequences for those who engage in harmful behavior. It would also be great to take a proactive approach to deter repeat offenders and have clear feedback to users about what happens when they report something. Um, and lastly, kind of thinking about a culture shift with digital platforms themselves. As I said before, design shapes behavior. So if apps continue to prioritize endless swiping, the number of connections that you have, quick judgments, all of this reinforces superficial and sometimes disrespectful interactions. And to be clear, I'm not saying that this is the fault of apps, but they do have a responsibility to their users to create safe spaces so that folks feel comfortable using their platforms and have the tools available to stay and feel safe in those interactions. Um, so all in all, I just think that apps need to take a more active role, and that means clearly communicating expectations and having clearer consequences for those who infract upon them.
Great. And our discussion so far has focused largely on young people. You've also looked at older people. You've looked at 2SLGBTQ plus people over 50 and their online behavior. So I thought I would ask you for any of them who may be watching what you found there.
Yeah, so this was work that we did at the end of the pandemic because we were really interested in understanding again how these everyday interactions that people are having with technology could have an impact beyond just around the specific connectivity issues that they might be having, or these kind of deficit-based models that would position or might incorrectly assume that just because you're old, you're unable to use technology or you can't use technology. And so we wanted to look a bit more holistically as to what are the experiences that 2S LGBT plus people over 50, what are their experiences with technology? And what we found, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that technology plays an important yet complex role in their lives. On one hand, we found that digital platforms can be incredibly valuable. So participants talked about using technology to maintain social connections, especially during the social isolation of the pandemic. And for them, these online spaces made it possible to stay connected with friends, family, chosen family, and broader 2S LGBT plus communities that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. At the same time, we found that participants recognized that digital connections couldn't fully replace in-person community. And there were a lot of participants who talked about the loss of physical space, like pride events, community centers, social gatherings, and how moving online actually reduced visibility of queer and trans communities as well as a sense of belonging. They didn't necessarily feel as connected because of the barriers that technology could create. There were even some participants in the study who expressed concern that 2S LGBT plus communities could become less visible, and that could have broader social and political consequences, such as like the removal or the rescinding of rights that have been hard fought by these communities over decades. Um, we also found that access to and comfort with technology varied greatly among 2S LGBT plus seniors. Some people were very engaged and used digital technologies more regularly, while others felt left behind, and they specifically used that word left behind by how quickly tech changes. Some also talked about barriers like cost, access to device, a lack of digital literacy. For some, there were concerns about mobility, so actually physically using these devices. So all of this speaks to these broader issues around digital inequities that can exist not just for 2S LGBT plus people, but for the population in general. Um, and In terms of health, because that was another big thing that we looked at with this particular project, we found that there wasn't necessarily good or bad health. It's really a combination of both. Some found, as I said before, because of technology, their social health, so their ability to connect with other people, was facilitated by these technologies. But for others, they talked about addiction, the impacts that it had on their mental health and well-being. So in that regard, even if they were able to connect with other people, it wasn't just about social health. It could have an impact on their well-being, on their mental health. And because of mobility barriers and even just like sitting for too long, using a screen, looking at stuff for too long, they talked about then the physical and mental health challenges that were associated with technology. So that project really revealed the variety of impacts that technology could have, whether for better or for worse, on 2S LGBT plus people over 50. And it also speaks to why health interventions and other types of digital interventions, digital literacy programs, community supports are really important to this population because it helps them foster community. It can help address concerns around visibility and certainly can support their health as they age.
Okay, and this raises the question, which you've also referred, I think, a little bit to in your answer there, around the digital divide and 2SLGBTQ plus people. You looked at it, I think, particularly for older people, but is there more that you'd want to say there? Or?
Yeah, so just to be clear, this idea of the digital divide, it means that not everybody necessarily has the same access or ability to use digital platforms. So often there's just assumption in today's technologically connected world that everybody has a laptop or everybody has a cell phone, that everybody has reliable Wi-Fi. That's not necessarily always the case. And again, it's not just about access to these technologies, it's also ability to use technologies. And so, yes, to your question, there definitely is a digital divide, and it's quite significant. And it's important to understand that it's not just about whether somebody uses technology or not. It's really, again, how people are able to access, engage with, and benefit from these digital technologies. So going back to this project and some other research that I've done, we found that access to technology can vary. Some people are very comfortable in online spaces and use digital tools reliably to stay connected, access information, entertain themselves, engage with community. But others face real barriers where things like affordability, access to reliable internet, digital literacy, or just even simply keeping up with updates can be barriers that impede people's use of digital tech. Um, and what I also want to note is that this divide isn't random. As I've kind of talked about previously, this digital divide is shaped by broader social inequities. So factors like income, education, geography, disability, past experiences with marginalization, all of this can influence who is able to meaningfully participate in digital spaces. Um, and I also want to note that the impact of this divide can actually be quite profound. Because nowadays, so much social life, healthcare, community engagement, information seeking, all of this happens online. Because all of this happens online, any type of limited access to technology can severely restrict people's ability to stay connected, to access services, and just to maintain their overall well-being or social participation. So in this study, participants talked about how digital platforms could support their connection, but when access was limited, it also meant increased isolation. So in this sense, digital access isn't just about convenience. We have to understand it as a determinant of health. If you're excluded from digital environments, you're also being excluded from key resources that allow you to promote your social health, your emotional well-being, or in some cases, just civic engagement in general. Um, so ultimately, addressing this digital divide means going beyond individual skills and again, looking at structural issues to consider things like affordability, design, digital literacy, community supports, all these types of things that can allow people to fully participate in today's digital world.
Absolutely. And On that note, my final question, in terms of participating,
Mm,
I thought I would ask a broader question about a topic that is very prominent at the moment, around banning of social media for young people.
yeah.
What are your views on that? Do you think it should be banned, and why or why not?
So, just to give folks who are following along a bit of context, this question has particularly come out in the past few months when, back in December of 2025, the Australian government was the first country in the world to ban social media, and they banned social media for youth under 16. Now, to be clear, the ban is around access to these platforms. And so it doesn't actually remove the platforms themselves. There's an expectation, or there's actually a responsibility on these social media companies to have preventable mechanisms that do not allow youth under 16 to access their platform. So the law doesn't say doesn't mandate how that age verification process happens. It just says it is the tech company's responsibility to make sure that youth under 16 cannot access their platforms. So, there's obviously a lot to say about that. First and foremost, because age verification, there's not necessarily reliable age verification measures. There's not a consistent way to identify who is under 16. So already in the past couple of months, as that law has been enacted, we've seen that there's great variation in terms of who's still on these platforms versus who isn't. Folks have been inappropriately flagged around age. But what I think is the bigger issue here, which is what the bill actually intends to address, is this question around digital harms, which has been our conversation going on this entire time. The bill, the reason it came into effect is because recognizing that there's so many digital harms that young people or people of any age can experience through technology. The government had a lot of political will. There was a good amount of motivation across the political spectrum to enact something to try to limit the impacts on young people. Now, to come back to this question around should social media be banned, my response is I would say no, not at least as a standalone solution. And some of the reasons are reasons that I've already highlighted or alluded to. The main one being that restriction to social media doesn't actually remove the harm. What that means is that those harms still exist. It just means that you have to be 16 or above now in order to be in a space where those harms can occur. So it does nothing to put the responsibility on the tech companies to remove those harms, to be proactive or preventative in terms of seeking out potentially problematic behavior or other scams, fraud, extortion, sexual violence, discrimination, any host of things, any variety of things. There's no accountability for the platforms in that regard. So first and foremost, it does nothing to actually address the harms that are occurring. It just delays them, which then also means that if it's a problem for youth under 16, wouldn't that also be a problem for people over 16? The law also doesn't do anything to educate or prepare young people or their parents, their communities, in order to address these harms. So there's no investment in education, no public awareness building. So even if the delay then comes until they're 16, it doesn't necessarily use that time to get people prepared to address these issues. So another concern in that regard is that because, as I said before, there's concerns around how then people are identified. There's an inconsistency and still in terms of who's able to access these spaces. And along those lines, as we should probably expect with young people, where there's a will, there's a way. Like they have had social media up until this point, up until December of 2025. So many of them are probably still going to use, or let me rephrase that, are still using social media, knowing that the age verification doesn't necessarily work. We also are seeing, or there's a risk that this could push young people to different spaces. So the law actually only bans certain social media platforms, not all of them. It just bans the largest ones. So TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. There are big ones that are now banned. But because these are actually the biggest ones, they are the ones who have the most money. They have the biggest systems. They have the most regulation. So what this means is that then this can also push people to less regulated or more hidden, darker, dangerous spaces where there's fewer protections. So not only does it not remove the problems, but it could push people to find new spaces where there's more problems. Um, and so all in all, I think what this I do understand the logic behind doing something. Certainly in Canada, as well as elsewhere in the world, there's a lot of conversation around the harms, as we've been talking about this entire time, the range of harms that people can experience through their use of technology. So absolutely, in some way or another, I do think there should be regulation. I just don't think that a social media ban is the right way to do it.
Thank you, and very
But
clear and
good.
well argued. And your responses to all of the questions, I think, have been really rich. They reflect that you've have thought a lot about the issues that we've talked about, but you've also taken time to prepare for what we were doing today, and I really appreciate you doing it, Chris. It's going to be really valuable to the people who will watch this and use it in their course. So yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you doing this. Oh, you've
My
frozen.
pleasure, because oh yeah, I'll probably use bits and pieces as well, just for my own students or my own networks and things. So I must admit it was really fun preparing for this, just to be able to reflect on this and as academics, so often we get time to write, but to just be able to talk about our work is truly a pleasure. So thank you. Yeah.
I agree.